Vietnam, Lou EISENBRANDT, 1969 to 1970. Lou served as an Army nurse with the 91st Evac Hospital in Chu Lai. Her story is both gripping and inspiring. Lou saw the horrors and ravages of war. In the midst of the wounded and the dying, sometimes the best thing they could do with a patient was simply hold their hand, which Lou did many times. I'd like to extend a personal thank you to John Wynn for sponsoring this story. John, thank you. God bless you, brother. John was born in Vietnam and grew up as a young boy during the war, and he has such a love and a heart for our Vietnam veterans. And John, again, personally thank you for sharing this story, making it possible for others to see it. If you would like to sponsor a story, please contact me. I have more information in the video description underneath this video, and I would really invite you to become a part of this documentary series and help me, like John has helped me, share these stories with the world. It would mean a lot. And now it is my great pleasure to present to you one of my favorite Vietnam stories from a Vietnam War hero of mine, Lou EISENBRANDT. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.
From October of 1969 through October of 1970.
One tour then?
One tour.
And did you enlist or drafted, or what happened to you?
Well, as a woman, we weren't drafted. I guess you would say we enlisted. I signed up at the end of my junior year in nurses training. And then I served, technically my senior year I was considered on active reserve status, went to school, and then I was required to serve 2 years after that, after I graduated.
Were you like a lot of the young men at the time? Did you feel a duty to serve your country, or what sparked that interest to?
Two very practical reasons. One was I wanted a means of paying back my parents who had paid for my nursing education, which was very minimal in those days, but we didn't have much to start with, and I wanted to be able to do that. And secondly, I grew up in Southern Illinois, very close to Scott Air Force Base, which was a huge Air Force base, and all my high school friends were Air Force brats. And there was no money in my family for travel, and I thought this was my chance to do as the posters said and see the world. Now, I had in mind Germany, England. I didn't have Vietnam, but when you say yes to Uncle Sam, you go where they send you.
So you were in nursing school, and then you went into military training? Is that what happened to you?
At the end, I graduated in June of '68, and in November, I was sent to Fort Sam Houston, Texas for officers' basic training for 6 weeks, and then got orders for Fort Dix, New Jersey, which was my first duty assignment.
How did you end up going overseas?
I was at Fort Dix for about 9 months and got a manila envelope in the mail one day and said, "Congratulations, you're going to Vietnam."
That was it?
That was it.
And how did you feel at that time? I mean, fearful or anticipating doing it? How did you feel about that?
I guess I wasn't necessarily overly fearful. I'm sure my parents were terrified. But my roommate that I had at Fort Dix had gotten orders about 6 months prior. So I knew that a lot of women were going. So it was, I probably nervous, just not sure what to expect, because I hadn't been very far from home at that point.
So when you went to Vietnam, what do you remember about arriving in country the first time? The geography, the smell, the heat? What do you remember about that?
When you fly into Vietnam, the first thing you notice is brown. It's a lush country, but when I arrived, it was rainy season, monsoon season, and so the water, you fly over the rivers, and it's very brown. You open the door to the plane, and there's an incredible blast of hot, humid air. Smells, a lot of different smells. At that point, though you're flying into a base, so it's not like being among the people, and so it didn't have the same impact that it does once you get off at your duty assignment, and then it really does sort of hit you.
So what type of training are you an OR nurse or?
I had no specific training at all. I served my first 3 months after I received my duty assignment and was sent up to the 91st Evac. I spent the first 3 months on a medical ward, seeing anything from hepatitis, malaria, jungle rot, which is what you get when you walk in water in combat boots for days on end and don't dry your feet out, intestinal worms, anything that was not a war wound I saw for 3 months. And then I was asked by the chief nurse if I would consider moving down to what we would call the emergency room, which was R&E, receiving an emergency. And so I spent the last 8 months in the emergency room.
Were there a lot of women with your group as you went over? Did you deploy by yourself when you went over?
When I went over, there were 13 women on the flight out of San Francisco. And we all got split up when we got there. We didn't go to the same place. When I came back, I was the only woman on the plane.
Were you at the 77th back?
No, 91st. 91st at Chulai.
Chulai, okay. And how many beds there? I mean, hospitals are rated by beds. I mean, how many casualties or wounded?
Well, I mean, that was the thing about Vietnam in terms of what sort of casualties we would get. And we were a full, I guess you'd say a full service hospital. We had all the normal things that a hospital would have. We also had a Vietnamese ward, so we saw Vietnamese civilians if villages got hit. We had a POW ward, so we saw Viet Cong and NBA. We had OR and recovery and all that sort of stuff, intensive care and the ER. In terms of particularly once I moved to the emergency room, the caseload varied from day to day. I mean, I remember working a shift and had one guy come in with an ingrown toenail. I also remember the day that a village got hit, a Vietnamese village, and we had 99 patients within the 12-hour span that I was on duty. So it varied dramatically.
So just tell me a little bit about the casualties, the wounded that you were treating, Army, Marines, burns. I mean, just give me again, in the hospital, the surroundings, and it's, I guess, all kinds of wounds, but...
Everything.
Were you on a specific floor, or tell me about...
No, there were no floors. These were, the 91st was a series of metal Quonset huts, which is what many of the evac hospitals were. The only, that I know, multi-level, what we would think of as a regular building hospital was in Saigon. It was the 3rd Surgical in Saigon. So we wore fatigues every day. And in terms of what we saw, absolutely everything. Like I said, it varied from the ingrown toenail to medical issues, a lot of casualties. And the casualties, I would say, if I had to say what did we see the most of, it would have been what we called frag wounds or shrapnel. When you blow something up, you get little tiny pieces of metal that break off, and depending on where they lodge in the body, you can either live with lots of tiny wounds, or you can take one to the aorta and die within a very short period of time. I saw many amputees, 1, 2, 3 limbs. Head injuries, lots of gunshot wounds. For those who have never seen one, it makes most gunshots, most bullets make a very small entry wound, very large exit wound. So some of those were very deceptive. First thing we would do in the emergency room was to cut the clothes off of whoever came in so we could totally assess their wounds, because there was a wide variance.
Were they coming in at all times of the day, or like in MASH, the helicopters come in? I mean, were the helicopters bringing them in?
Most of our patients either came by ambulance or helicopters, probably more by helicopters than anything else. And they would come in all hours of the day and night. We worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, so 12 hours on and 12 hours off. And everybody, civilian, in terms of casualties, Marine, obviously the units that were close by we saw more of, but we would see all the different branches of service, as well as Vietnamese civilians, like I said.
Are there any particular stories or casualties that, that come to mind that were more, or were they all kind of like a blur after a while? Are there any particular stories or people that you saw or maybe even followed through after the war, that you come to mind?
Oh, yes. First of all, in general, the one thing you never forget are white phosphorus burns. Horrendous damage to a person. And there is a smell that to this day I will never get out of my head. I will never forget the smell of that because it continues to burn the skin. In terms of special people, I do remember well a young man who came in and was a double amputee. He'd lost both of his legs. And he'd also taken a gunshot wound to the chest. And so when we stripped him down and rolled him over, his back stayed on the litter. I will never forget that as long as I live. He actually lived long enough through surgery that we evacuated him out to Japan, so I have no idea what happened to him after that. The other one that really stands out in my mind was a young man from the South who I met the day I came in country. He came in with me. We sort of became friends, and he was assigned to a unit not far from our hospital. Came in early, a couple months after we got there, with some of his men who'd been wounded, and he had some light wounds. It wasn't a big deal. Went back out, and a couple months later he came, or probably 6 or 7 months later, he came back in again, and he was peppered from head to toe with shrapnel. And I didn't happen to be assigned to him. I was assigned to another a patient on another litter. But when they took him into the ER, into the OR, my friend who was working on him said, he'll probably lose both of his legs. And that was the only time that I would say, lost it. I just simply had to leave because I felt a really close personal attachment. I did follow up with him actually afterwards. I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, which is where he was. He still had his legs, but he wasn't able to use them at all. And I think about him often and wonder if he still has his legs or if he finally lost them.
12-hour days, 6 days a week, that has to take a toll on you. How do you debrief? How do you unstress, unwind? Do you drink? Do you rest? Really, how do you do that?
I have a saying that I've always contended was the case in Vietnam, and that was that we worked very hard and we played very hard. I felt, for myself personally, I needed to decompress at the end of my shift. Now, when you work in the emergency room, anytime you'd hear more than 3 helicopters coming in, you would report whether it was your shift or not. But yes, there was drinking. There was lots of drinking that went on. I know there were drugs. I personally did not get involved with drugs, but I know drugs were an issue. I don't think so much at the hospitals as, with the guys out in the bush. There were parties. There were dances. There was a sort of random band. The guys had all been instrumentalists before they came in the Army, and their duty was to be a band, and they went around to entertain. So yes, you partied hardy because you had to do something to forget. I also kept a journal, so writing helped. I think the people that really struggled with like PTSD when they came home were those that didn't give themselves an outlet, because you cannot do that and then go back to your room and sit and think about that all night until you go on duty again. You had to kind of take yourself out of the situation.
That's interesting. Just for reference, I've interviewed over 70 veterans and have just produced my first Vietnam film, and it's being released and premiered next week in Phoenix. Hey, you gotta come. But it's very powerful. It's going to really strike a nerve in our country. And the thing that it does, I think, is really helps to shape that image of Vietnam as being more, not such a negative thing. And the Vietnam veteran, who I think has gotten a bad rap over the years, and I'm very excited about that. It's going to be a significant event, but I'll get you a copy of that.
Okay.
The reason I even mention that is because of just talking with you and listening and then thinking of all these veterans I've talked to, but I think I'm jumping ahead, so I'm going to come back to the 91st evac. But
Okay.
a focus of my work is the helicopters. Just intrigued by the Hueys and the medevac pilots that I've talked to, and how that really was the forerunner for what we have today in the EMS system.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, being a nurse, were you out on the helipad, or you in the hospital, and did it ever become routine that the patients came in, or was every case individual? And are you very compassionate, a lot of caring? Is that a prerequisite for a nurse? Or?
Oh, I think it has to be a prerequisite for a nurse. But you also have to reach the point of being, I definitely would not say robotic, but you can't, the first week that I was in the emergency room, it was tough because you saw things you had never seen before, and I will never see again. No matter what kind of trauma nursing you do back here, it can't compare with what I did on a daily basis. But at the same time, you do have to develop a persona that says, I'm going to do what needs to be done, because I would have been useless if I had fallen apart, you know, every time we got a casualty in. And in terms of where we were, what we did, usually the corpsmen met the helicopters that would land on the helipad was literally right outside the emergency room. I mean, there was they carried them on gurneys. It was a very short distance. Usually those were met by the corpsmen, and so we usually stayed inside the building unless there was some sort of issue. I personally did not do any rescue flights on helicopters. I did go up once with a Loach pilot, which stands for Light Observation Chopper. It's a little bubble top thing, like a weather thing. But it was strictly a fun journey. I took photographs out of the helicopter, and it was just a friend who said he would take me up one day. So I did not do any missions traveling with helicopters. There were a few nurses that did that, but no one from our hospital did that. So,
well, Lou, what are your thoughts about at that time about war, Vietnam? Our country, you know, the fighting, what we're doing there. I've asked the Vietnam vets if they had a strong sense of purpose of being over there, and just what were your thoughts as a nurse seeing all this every day about what was happening in Vietnam and our purpose for being there?
well, I think when I arrived, I think I had the Florence Nightingale syndrome, which was I was going to save the world and I was going to save lives and I was doing wonderful, wonderful work, which I did. I mean, I think every day we saved lives. There's an old joke in nursing school. We'd go off to, you know, the hospital, save lives, and we never really saved lives. But we truly were saving lives every day. But I think, like so many GIs, it didn't take me too long to get a bit jaded and realize there wasn't a chance in hell we were going to win that war. We were fighting an enemy who could live in tunnels for 3 months underground underneath our compounds. They knew what was going on, and you can't win against someone who has that sort of stamina. Occasionally we would get patients from underground hospitals. The VC had a whole series of tunnels, 270 kilometers down at Cu Chi alone. And anybody who goes back to Vietnam ought to visit those to really just get a full grasp of what was going on. But occasionally tunnel rats would go in and they'd flush out one of these tunnels in the area where we were, and we'd get patients in. Unbelievable. I mean, broken limbs in these see-through casts, maggots running up and down the legs, and covered with dirt, just filthy, filthy, filthy. So you can't, it just became clear to me pretty soon that pretty early on, also, my parents would send letters and say, well, the reports we get back home are such and such, and those of us who were there knew that that was not the full truth. So I think, I know I came back thinking, number one, we weren't going to win the war, and number two, why were we staying there that long? We lost so many lives.
Did a lot of those patients die there? And then they're taken home? Is that what happens?
Well, it depends on the situation. Usually, there were, if someone came in for something that wasn't too serious, they stayed there until they were patched up or healed, depending on what their ailment was, and then they were sent back out in the field with their unit. If it was a serious injury, we usually stabilized them until they were strong enough to go, usually down to Saigon and then Tokyo or Germany or wherever. Clearly those who were, I would say several times a week, we would get in either KIA, killed in action, DOA, dead on arrival, in body bags. Those would go to what was called graves and then shipped back to this country. And occasionally we would get in guys that when the triage process was done, it was determined that there was no way to save their life. And what we usually did, if there were enough of us nurses, and there were only 2 or 3 of us on duty at a time, depending on how many casualties, they were usually put on a gurney back against the wall with a screen, and one of us would sit and hold their hand until they died, because there wasn't much else we could do.
Did that happen a lot, holding the hands? The World War II nurses I've talked to said they just wanted somebody to hold their hand.
Yes, it did. I was
That's touching.
refreshing my memory and reading the book, and there were, I remember on numerous occasions, if they were conscious, most of them weren't, but if they were, or the guys that came in that weren't quite so badly wounded, would look up and look at you and say, "Hey, you look like my girl back home." I get goosebumps thinking about that. So it was a little comfort to them. And yes, holding hands was good. And we tried to do that whenever we had enough people on hand to do that.
So you said you held the hand of that soldier and he died?
Mm-hmm.
Did that happen a lot when they died? Holding the hands, and you know they're going to die? And
Mm-hmm.
what are they saying? Do you remember?
Well, most of them that were that close to death were not conscious to be saying much of anything. It was more a breathing. But it's, we were just doing what we could, and there were times that, they'd say, "Am I going to die?" And of course we would say, "No, we're going to patch you up, you'll be fine." And sometimes we were able to, but many times we weren't.
What goes through your head at that time, that this guy's got a family, or is it your job, or what are you thinking of? You have faith in God, maybe you're praying for them, or what's?
Oh, I think all of us had some sort of spiritual background or spirituality, whether it was organized religion, or you just, what do they say? You find religion when you need it, or something like that.
No atheists in the foxhole?
That's the expression. But I don't know what was going through my mind, to be honest with you. Sometimes it was just a blur, and it was the physical sense of holding a hand, and yet we were maybe even at the same time communicating with something else that was going on, and asking questions or answering. It just depended on the situation. If we only had 1 or 2 casualties, then it was probably a more interactive sort of thing. Otherwise, it was more I am here, but there's all this hubbub going on, and you're dealing with a lot of different things at one time.
Boy, what a story you're telling here. Have you ever talked like this, or is this something you talk about at home, or
Well, the year that I was there, I took slides rather than taking prints, which I think in the long run probably was a good thing, because I was approached probably 20 years ago by a teacher who said, there's almost nothing written at the back of the history books about Vietnam. Would you consider coming and talking to my class? So I put together, from the many slides I had, left out the party slides and left out some of the other slides, and put together a series of slides just pretty much about my year there. What I did, where I went, a little bit about Hong Kong, which is where I took my R&R. And so that started a kind of a career. I've been speaking to students of all ages since then. So, and I think it has helped me, and I think it also is good for the students, because really you get to the end of the year, and for instance, my son-in-law now teaches history, and he says, they almost run out of time at the end of the year with all the other things they have to complete in order to cover Vietnam. So I come in and speak to his students. He said it has a much greater impact sharing my slides and talking to them in 1 hour than what he could cover in a week or more about the war. So that's my little contribution.
Do you have these slides over on prints? Have you made prints out of these slides?
I have finally gotten all the Vietnam ones done, yes. I just recently decided that and I'm doing this for my children, because I don't see them getting the slide projector out on a Friday night to sit down and look at Mom's slides of Vietnam. So I'm having them all put on DVD and on CDs.
Can I get a copy
So
for
they're
this
easy.
project? Because this is valuable. I mean, if you've got anything over there that we could use for this, I would appreciate seeing it at some point.
Sure.
Okay. I like the fact of the schools. I talk in schools, and that's very important. Like you said, it's a first-hand account being there. I travel with an 84-year-old World War II veteran.
Oh, that's
And so
great.
we've done a lot, and so I'm glad that you're doing that. That's very important. That's a mission. That's good.
Well, it's also, I would like to think that we would learn from our past. I'm not sure right now we have learned from our past, but I would like to think that the more we talk about what war really is, it's not Rambo and it's not the movies you see, it's reality. And I think the more we can speak to that, the better we can educate young minds.
There's a song on my Vietnam film by John Fogerty. It's called Deja Vu, and it's part of the documentary, but it's kind of comparing today to Vietnam, and it's good. And he gave me a license to use of it. So
Great.
I'd be interested to have you
Great.
do that too.
Yes.
Anyways, well, I'm enjoying this. I may jump around a little bit here, but
That's okay.
Because I usually interview the combat troops, the grunts, and all that. You know, and the
So,
pilots. and
I
now,
didn't-
now I've got engineers.
I didn't shoot anybody. I could though. I knew how to use a
Oh, I know.
M16, but
A question. The VC and the MVA, you said you had a POW award or whatever. Tell me about the enemy. I mean, what did you learn about the enemy through your interaction, maybe with them at the hospital?
very clever, very dedicated to the cause, very dedicated to the cause. Also, an interesting scenario in that, and I think people have found this to be true in other wars, Vietnam was not a war where the enemy had a really different face from everybody else. When you saw a Vietnamese person, you weren't quite sure whether they were friend or enemy, which created lots of issues for the guys out in the field. And, you know, sometimes you could get a feel for the fact that you thought, well, maybe the enemy looks different, but they really didn't. I mean, a big issue was not just incoming mortar rounds, but snipers that would snip wires and crawl in and just mingle with the rest of the, you know, of the South Vietnamese friendlies. So that was, that was, I think, a big issue in Vietnam, is that there were too many people looking alike. I guess that sounds strange, but it's really true.
Next week, I'm going to interview some South Vietnamese who fought with the Americans, the ARVNs, and that's a goal of mine in Phoenix. I'm looking forward to that.
That's terrific.
But you know, as far I've heard some of these things from the guys too about the Viet Cong. They'd be out plowing the fields during the day, and at night they'd be shooting at them in their black pajamas. You know, and you hear a lot of this type of thing.
And it's similar to what we hear now with suicide bombers and things, strapping things onto children. There were women, children who fought for the other side, for the cause, and so you did not know whether that child you were looking at was friendly or not.
It's scary. It's so different today, and even in Vietnam versus like World War II, where you had a uniform enemy,
Yes.
and it was very obvious the line was drawn and all that.
And there were also, quote, front lines in the other wars. There were no front lines in Vietnam. I mean, we would take mortar attacks. The North Vietnamese seemed to celebrate the seasons and the holidays by bombing us. So we would get incoming rockets like on the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox and that sort of, and the Tet Offensive, of course, was around the New Year's time period. But they really, that was just something. There were no front lines. It wasn't like, okay, you're there and I'm here and I'm going to shoot you because you're in front of me. It was all around. It was all around, so there was no way to know.
You mentioned holding hands of patients, but what did you practice? What did you do? Did you change IVs, dressings? I mean, or did you do what was asked of you? Was there a specific job you did? Meds? I mean, what type of thing did you do?
Everything. Much leeway. A lot of things we wouldn't be allowed to do. I wouldn't be allowed to do now. Starting chest tubes, starting IVs, lots of IVs. I mean, and that was the old days when we still had the glass bottles that hung, no plastic bags back then, and lots of wounds, some massive. Basically, the only care that casualties got before they came to our hospital was by the aidman out in the field, and he would slap on dressings. Maybe there was a battalion aid station where they'd start an IV, and that was all that they would get before they came into our hospital. So we did that. We gave meds. We just did everything there was that needed doing, and you didn't ask for a doctor's order. You didn't have to record. I mean, you did try to record what you'd done, but it's quite different from nursing today.
If they were given morphine in the field, how did they mark them?
Yes,
Forehead?
they did. Yes. Yeah, those things were crucial so that we would know, so you wouldn't overdose somebody on something like that.
So when you're training, were you prepared properly for what you encountered, or the on-the-job training?
What do you think?
OJT.
Yeah. I was very fortunate. I went to an excellent nursing program, and it was a 3-year RN program, which is what almost all the programs were back in the 60s. But so by the time I graduated from nurses training, I knew how to start IVs. I knew how to do a lot of serious stuff that some women who did, shorter programs or college programs didn't have the practical hands-on. I also then spent 9 months in Fort Dix and was actually the head nurse for a time period for a ward that had 300 patients. So I had lots of practical practice before I got there. Now, obviously not training in what I was going to be doing, but I had enough knowledge that I wasn't overly frightened. But I have read accounts from nurses who maybe did the 2-year baccalaureate program and went straight to Vietnam, and they really struggled. They really had a lot of issues. So I felt that I was more fortunate than some who went over with less training. But you just learn, and the docs are there, and you're working very closely with them, and it's definitely on-the-job training for something like that, though. There's no way to prepare.
Did it get chaotic at times, or was it organized chaos, or was it everything organized?
I would say it was organized chaos, particularly if you had, we basically had about 4 gurneys, 4 sawhorses, for lack of a better description, where we could set the litters on. And if we got more than 4 that were not ambulatory, not walking, we had to find a place to put them, and that's when it would get a little crazy. Also, you have to understand that almost none of us, those of us who were in the U.S. military, spoke Vietnamese. I mean, we knew maybe a handful of important words for pain and water and doctor and a few other things, but that was it. So we always had to have Vietnamese translators. We actually had a Vietnamese nurse and 2 aides that worked with us in the emergency room, which was great if we got in Vietnamese casualties. We also had a couple young Vietnamese men who just worked as translators for us when we got in patients that did not speak English. We were fine with the GIs, but our language skills were definitely lacking. So, yeah, I would say organized chaos, and you have to move fast. I mean, there literally were times, like I said, there were lives being held in the balance, and you had to move rather quickly. As a matter of fact, in the 12-hour shifts that we worked, if it was a really slow day, we would get 3-hour breaks. They were 7 to 10, 10 to 1, 1 to 4. And another way of sort of escaping the war was to go down. We had a little tiny beach because we were on a cliff overlooking the South China Sea. And somebody, through careful bartering, I guess, had acquired a boat. So we actually water skied. I became quite a good water skier. We would take our break time and go down and, water ski, only before noon because the sharks came in the afternoon, so we couldn't ski in the afternoon. But we would go down and do that. But the minute you would hear choppers, you would come up in whatever outfit you were wearing and pitch in. So there was the protocol was, there were not issues with, oh my gosh, your uniform isn't perfect and your shoes aren't spit shine, because there just was not time for that on many occasions.
Well, I have to bring in Radar O'Reilly and MASH when you talk about the choppers coming in. I mean, do you ever watch MASH?
I've watched it faithfully. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing about the movie, which of course came out before the television show, was that it came out not too long before I left Vietnam, and there was a tiny movie theater just off of where our hospital was. And they would get films in there, and the movie MASH was going to be shown the night that I left country. So when I got back to the States, I had already planned to hook up with another nurse who had been in Vietnam and left a couple months ahead of time. And we kind of did a driving tour. She was in Minneapolis, and we covered 6 weeks on the road through the Northwest and stayed, every place we stopped, we stayed with nurses we knew in Vietnam, which was a wonderful way to decompress for both of us. But that, when I got home later that week, I flew up to Minneapolis, and we went to see MASH at the drive-in theater. And it's probably a good thing we went to the drive-in, because we laughed and cried and screamed and yelled. And yes, oh yes, very. I still occasionally will watch MASH while I'm on the treadmill.
Was that with Donald Sutherland, the movie?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was. It was great fun, and there were. I'm not sure we were quite as irreverent as they were in the movie, but we had our moments. We had our moments.
I had a question and I forgot. I'll come back to it. But the Vietnam veteran. Why do you think so many of them had problems when they came home? Now, I've asked them, but I want to hear what you have to say. Why do you think a lot of them suffered the way they did, and even today are suffering? Okay.
And there were nurses, or are nurses, that had issues as well, because I've read about them. And I recontacted, or got back in touch with about 20 women I hadn't seen since we left at the dedication of the Women's Memorial back in '93. So I know that there are nurses that have had issues. Oh, I think the reasons are plentiful. The main one is that the United States in and of itself did not support the war. Never did. I don't think from day one they supported the war. And now in hindsight, you look back at people like McNamara who said, well, I had an issue, but I didn't want to say anything. Hello? You know, you could have saved a lot of lives by just saying, I don't think we need to continue doing this. Let's quit now. So I think that was the big issue, I think that was the biggest issue, was that the general public was not in support of the war. And unfortunately, everybody had to, all the guys had to go. I mean, basically, except those who were very privileged and were able to get out of, you know, not making that trek. So it was just, I think it was easy for people to take it out on the vets, especially those that came back to college campuses in large cities. I came back to a small town, downstate Illinois, where they treated veterans just like they have since the Civil War. It was a big deal, and I was the first female veteran they had ever had. So they all thought that was pretty neat. So I didn't really face that at all. But I think because the people didn't support the war, I think also because there was just, I don't think we could see, when we were there, we could see that we were doing any good. I really think most of the GIs, that's just my opinion, but I think most of the GIs realized after a period of time that they hadn't done anything that was going to change the world. They were just trying to stay alive, frankly.
You mentioned 20 women you reacquainted with for the memorial. Do you, I'll ask you about this later though, do you have contacts with these people? Or?
I do with some of them now, yes.
Maybe you could email me some information as I travel. I would love to get some good stories, and since I've talked to you, I need to pick up more stories.
Okay.
I interviewed a nurse in South Carolina in March, and she had some problems. You mentioned that, and but anyways, so I didn't think about that, but I'm sure a lot of the nurses.
Well, yes, I think there are nurses that have had problems. The other, when people say to me, "Did you have?" I think I was very fortunate. Like I said, came back to small town. I had good nurses training in the beginning. I did not internalize everything. I had a good time. I'm very verbal about what I do. What you see is what you get, and I think that probably helped me. I think also that as a nurse, I was there in a healing role. I was not there to kill people. So nobody was calling me baby killer because I wasn't killing. Now, I knew how to use a weapon, and I would have used it if I felt a need to do it, but I didn't have to. And I think that just that different mindset, different role for me, I think made a big difference in terms of how I felt when I came back, because nobody could have accused me of killing other people. And now, nobody wanted to hear about it, and I think that's another reason a lot of the GIs had problems. You came back, some people, you know, it is therapeutic to talk about your experience, but nobody wanted to hear about it if they weren't there. They just simply weren't interested.
Are you patriotic today?
I'd like to think I'm very patriotic.
What does the flag mean to you as a veteran?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the flag as a symbol. I think the flag represents the country, but I think it represents all the freedoms we have, speech, religion, whatever else. So I am not one who's going to wrap myself in the flag and say, okay, you know, I don't want you breathing on the flag because it's, you know, that's unpatriotic. I think, to me, being patriotic, it means supporting what I think is best for our country and its people. So yes, I hang the flag out on, you know, important days and that sort of thing. But I would never, you know, I would probably not support an amendment to, you know, not allow anything else to be done to it. And because then I drive by somebody's house who's gallantly flying the flag, and the flag is in shreds, and I'm going, you know, if you really were that patriotic, why don't you go down to the local hardware store and spend $15 and get a new flag? Because it looks really pathetic. So I think sometimes we get caught up in minutia, and we shouldn't do that.
That's a new word.
That's my word for the day.
How do you spell it?
M-I-N-U-T-I-A, maybe.
Minutia? Tell me what that means later.
Okay.
I'll probably forget it. What about the price for freedom? I mean, you saw a lot of people wounded, killed, and the freedoms we have today, our country. Tell me about the price for freedom. What does that mean to you?
I think that, again, we get too caught up in specifics. I think that if we go back to our founding fathers, they did their best to say what was important in terms of freedom and things of that sort. I think treating each other respectfully is important. I think, and I find particularly in this day and age when we have America's become such a melting pot of people, that I think the freedom for all people who are here to be able to do what they do is important for freedom. I don't think that some of the things that are going on now I would consider important for freedom. I think freedom covers, like I said, all the basics and not just my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Is your husband a veteran?
My husband is not a veteran, and actually well, I shouldn't say, he served time in the reserves. Unlike me, he was actually looking for a reserve unit so that he hopefully wouldn't have to go to Vietnam, and he ended up in a medical reserve unit, which is actually how we met. He was, when I came back from Vietnam, I was out of the military, and the gal I was talking about did the driving tour with me. At the end of that tour, we ended up in Denver at Fitzsimmons, and which you know of, and so we landed civil service nursing jobs there because we were both out of the military, and that was in January of 1971, and in May of 1971, his summer camp duty with the reserves, he was in a medical unit as a corpsman, even though he's a lawyer, but you know, that was the way the Army worked in those days. He came out for his 2 weeks of summer camp, and we had 5 dates. He came back to Kansas City for a month and came back out and proposed, and we were married in November. So we met at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital over a patient.
Ah,
Mm-hmm.
that's good.
So no, and then he had, I don't know, 3 or 4 more years of reserve duty, and did that locally at a mental hospital.
Is that right?
Yes.
Tell me, have you been back to well, obviously you've been back to D.C. Did you go to the Vietnam Wall?
I've been there many times.
Can you tell me the first time you went and what you felt and why you went?
Well, I obviously went because I had a great interest in what was in seeing it. There are 8 women whose names are on the wall, and one of those is Sharon Lane, who was actually killed at my hospital about 4 months before I got there. So I kind of have I'd never met her, but you know, it's sort of a personal interest. And I've been there many times. I'm always struck by the quiet. People can be very boisterous and loud, and I've even been there in August when the Boy Scouts are all meeting for their jamboree, and there, you know, hundreds of kids walking around. But the minute they start down that path by that black wall, things just settle down. It's amazing to me. I've been there at night, which is absolutely phenomenal. I took some photographs with just the little spotlights shining up on it. It's wonderful. I went back for the dedication of the women's statue, and I've been there in the winter when nobody else has been there. It's a very, very, very moving experience for me. And I do have a rubbing from Sharon's name on my kitchen refrigerator, actually. So I think it is probably one of the most moving memorials that is there in D.C.
Are you proud that you're a Vietnam veteran?
You bet.
Have people thanked you for that?
Oh yes, people do that all the time. I mean, and it wasn't. I didn't set out to do this, which is kind of interesting. I like I said, my cause was far less noble. I was not doing this because I felt a dedication to anything. I wanted to see the world, and as I said, that wasn't on my list. And then once I left Vietnam, I really fell in love with the people there. You know, if anybody has cause to be upset, they certainly do. We devastated their country and killed, I think the numbers are more like 200,000 compared to our 58,000. And so I've been back twice because it just was important for me to go back and see what was left, what was there, what it's like. And it was
been back one time?
twice.
Twice?
And I plan to go again, hopefully before too many more years go by, because my husband did not go with me, and I would like for him to experience that.
Let me know when you go, because I want to go. Not necessarily with you, but I do want to go to Vietnam and take a couple of veterans. I've been to France with the D-Day.
Have you?
Been to Iwo Jima. So I'd like to go to Vietnam.
Well, it's first of all, it's a beautiful country, and it's actually more beautiful now because the effects of the Agent Orange are pretty much gone. So it's a lusher looking country than it was when we were there during the war. But now that my last trip was in '96, so it's been, you know, over 10 years, and I'm sure things have changed quite dramatically. But there are still a lot of they still plant the rice with water buffalo and plant it by hand, and a lot of the things that, you know, I remember from when I was there really have not changed.
When you're working in that environment at the 91st Evac, I mean, hospital, do they call it evac?
Evac, short for evacuation.
Okay. As you talk, I was trying to just imagine what it was like, but just being among all the casualties, there are different units. I'm sure there's burn units. There's different kinds. You saw all kinds of wounds and everything. And you saw it all.
I did.
You mentioned a couple of stories. I mean, it's just amazing to me that you probably had, hundreds and hundreds of contacts, patients, or thousands over that time that you were there. You were there a whole year in that hospital?
I was there almost a year. Yeah, I was about 3 weeks less. You know, what's interesting is, when you talked about the wall, when I go to the wall, I stand and look at it, and wonder in my mind how many of these, mostly men, young men, how many of them came through my hospital that I saw but have no idea, because there was no way for me to keep track of, who died, either at our hospital or after they left the hospital, and there would be no way for me to know. I know there is a registry. I've never actually looked in there, and I don't know, but I don't think that they would give, what their unit was. I don't know, maybe it would be, but still, I wouldn't know. But I've often thought about that as I stand there, was this a hand that I held? Or was this somebody I talked to and said, you're going to be fine? I don't know. But clearly a lot of them. Clearly a lot of them.
Just say a little bit about the medevac pilots and the medevac flights as far as the success of saving a lot of lives.
Huge, huge. And when I speak to students, I tell them that just in terms of the Huey helicopters, being able to lift the wounded out made a big difference. It started a bit in Korea, where they first used the helicopters. But in World War II, so many lives were lost because they simply couldn't get the wounded to any sort of medical facility. So in Vietnam, those helicopters made a huge difference picking them up and getting them out. And what's interesting is I just heard somebody addressing a similar issue in Iraq right now, and they said, oh, they're saving so many more people because of the speed with which, so I guess it just progresses as the wars go along. But I clearly saw that, and I've often said when people say, well, was that good or bad? And I said, you'd have to ask those who survived. We continue to hear over the years of people who are even now yet committing suicide, who've lived with PTSD or whatever for years and years and finally just can't take it anymore. And maybe it's because they, lost too many limbs or, had severe head injuries and have struggled with, mental issues and, or were blinded or whatever. So is it a good thing that we got all these people out? If you're just looking at the numbers, sure, you say it's great, but you have to also look at what happened. And I think that's another thing with Iraq right now. There are so many, we talk about the wounded, we talk about the dead, although I think we should be showing those coffins coming home. That's a personal belief of mine. I believe so strongly in that, because otherwise it's just somebody else's war. It's not our war. But I think the most important thing we need to focus in on are those who are still living and living with horrendous, disabilities, and talk to them. They're the ones that need to be vocal.
Can I ask you to do one more thing? Let me make sure I've asked all my questions. I'll probably think about it more. But at the end of my interviews with the veterans, I always have them give me a salute into the camera. Would you be comfortable if I ask you to do that?
I guess, I guess.
Okay, I'll tell you what.
I have a shaky hand, but I will do that.
I'm not gonna judge this.
Oh, okay.
You see the end of one of my films, I think it'll make sense to you.
I actually went on your website and watched a little bit of the
some of the clips?
the Vietnam one that you're gonna.
How recent were you on the website?
Last night.
Okay. Did you watch the CBS story? It's on the bottom of it.
No, I didn't. I need to do that.
It's good.
I was racing through things last night.
They talk about the salutes too and why.
Okay.
They do it. So, but just when you're ready, look into the camera.
Okay.
And go ahead. Great. That was good. I give you an 8.5.
I haven't done that in forever.